And we're live. Hello, everyone. First of all, I want to thank you for joining us today. I'm Agne, product owner here at Doc Labs, and I'm excited to introduce Richard Esplin, our head of product, who will be walking us through deploying unified identity architecture today. Before we dive into the presentation, I want to ask everyone to say hello in the chat and where you're listening from. It's nice for us to know that we're not just talking to ourselves. Also, if you have questions straight away or throughout the webinar, please put them in the chat and I will try to weave them in as we go. We'll also have a Q&A session at the end where we will be able to answer more of those questions. I also want to kind of shortly explain why we decided to do this webinar. So we work with a lot of customers that already have traditional identity systems in place. And after walking through the same architecture conversations dozens of times with different organizations, we realized that more people would find this information useful. There's different customers and different use cases, but the identity challenges are the same. And the architecture that can solve it is also the same. So with this short introduction, I'm going to pass the mic to Richard to show you how to do it.
Thank you, Agne. We don't have much time, so I'll just dive right in. Your boss comes to you and says, I need you to integrate a new application. And as a senior identity architect, you ask the same question we've all been tempted to ask at some point or another. Why don't our identity systems meet today's challenges? You built something, you spent years on it, it works, and yet you still have to change it. And it's because the organization is always changing. And the challenges that you lovingly architected your system to address aren't today's challenges, and they're definitely not tomorrow's challenges. And these changes, they naturally lead to fragmentation. Every new team that joins, every new partner you integrate with, every new tool that you're asked to build to include in your ecosystem requires a new integration. And you're on a timeline. The current system, you got to be careful not to disrupt the existing business. And so it's easier to set up a new system than to integrate it, than to adapt it for these new tools. And as a result, we end up with multiple IAM systems, and we end up with multiple records for the same person in our systems. And this always happens. It's just the nature of the challenge. It's the law of life. Now, for today's conversation, we want to anchor it in a specific example. This is a composite from multiple customers we've had that tries to highlight some key principles. So for this example, for today's conversation, we're looking at a scaled consumer-facing business. And scale, it creates silos. There's different teams that don't always talk to each other. They've got different policies and different tools. And because we grew our organization through acquisition, that means there's different platforms and different business units. And each database holds a different part of our customer's identity. So customers might come to us to prove their loyalty and get a discount, to pick up medicine, to pick up photos, or they might call in for one of these reasons. And each of these experiences touches a different database and has slightly different attributes about our consumer. When I was sharing this example with Agne, she said, photo pickup and medicine in the same shop? That's the way they do it in North America. I know that's not the way they do it in a lot of places, but I'm always picking up the printed baby photos when I pick up the baby medicine, right? As an IAM architect, we know better than this, but when we were students in school, we'd solve this problem with one big accounts database. Why can't we just use one big database? And the answer, we software engineer, is that the patient records have a different governance than the payment data, or than the photo data, or the loyalty data. Each of these things has their own governance, they have their own attributes, and they have their own life cycles. And so we can't put them all together. So, as IAM architects, we pull out the trusty tool of federation. And we use that typical IAM architecture. When the user's onboarding, we identity proof the user, then we create the account in the identity provider, the IDP for that user, and then they can use any integration that any application that we've integrated with our IDP. And this is a pretty good pattern. It's well understood. It's been used all over the place. There's mature technologies, and it allows for centralized governance, which gives us good tools for audit, for security, and for proving that we comply with policies. So in theory, we end up with this, our example organization ends up with this architecture. We've got our client web app. We've got our client mobile app. They both are going to talk to the IDP. Our employees can use the back office app to be able to, and they should come through to authenticate, to authn with the same identity provider. We've got our one beautiful IDP that solves all the problems. It's got an account for each of these users. If they're not onboarded yet, we can go out to do identity proofing and then create the account. We can even include a routine to do cross-application matching, so we can tell which applications people are using and reuse information that's needed. And so they authenticate into the identity provider, and then they can authorize from the identity provider response to one of the relying parties, the loyalty app, the medicine app, the photo app. And that should be the way it works. But in reality, it never works that way. When we're doing onboarding, we realize, oh wait, the patient data, that's got a different level of assurance than the loyalty data. And so we end up with two different identity proofing platforms that have different sources of data. And when we're trying to roll this out in the system, we realize that the medicine pharmacy IDP, it's got to be medical oriented. So it ends up being very different than the one that's used for just regular customer purchases. And so we end up with two different identity providers that we're that we're authenticating against. So when our client comes in on the mobile app or the web app, they might get different portions of their profile from each IDP, each identity provider. And then when they're authorizing into the authorization realm, that works. We pull that out of whichever IDP makes sense. But when we were asked to integrate the photos, that was under a tight timeline. We just needed to get that new offering up and running. So we just build that alongside the existing IDP. We don't bother integrating it at all. We've all been there. It makes sense in a lot of circumstances. But most annoying for me is when the internal users say, oh, we can't all share the same web app. The pharmacist doesn't want to know anything about the call center. The call center needs to integrate with their voice system. And so even though the customer is coming through the authentication realm to get authorized to talk to the call center employees, we just give those 10 people direct accounts in the call center database. Again, we've all been there. We know how it goes.
And Richard, if you don't mind me asking, when I'm looking at this diagram, I really like it. I always imagine it's like an enterprise, a big organization with a lot of different relying parties, a lot of different integrations. But would you say this is only for enterprises or is applicable for smaller businesses as well? Like, I mostly worked in startups all my life, but every time when the startup reaches a certain growth stage, a project of having a customer 360 view or a data, it always comes up. Everyone wants to have this reliable central data space where they can trust and see the information about the customer. So I'm curious, what do you think? With this, is it valuable for smaller organizations as well?
I think you're exactly right. That in fact, the small organizations often suffer worse because the large organizations have a big team doing IAM stuff. And a small organization is just random Susie, who's the IAM architect for the entire org, and she's always given a new project on a short timeline, and nobody wants to spend time on tech debt. So, I definitely have seen this in both types of organizations. So, these problems are real. This is a fictional example, but you've all suffered through this. We've all suffered through this. And Agne and I have been doing an effort where we try to interview IAM architects on a regular basis to get a sense of what's the current state of the industry, what are the current problems they face, what are their current needs. And this challenge of federation sprawl comes up a lot. 3 architects gave specific quotes that really stuck with me. Architect S said when she was hired, there were around 600 applications that needed to be integrated. And after a couple years, she'd integrated 120, and now there's 800 applications. The need keeps growing as the business grows. Now, she's providing a lot of value because she's solving the biggest pain points first, and she's doing the most pressing applications first. But yeah, it's a growing problem in her organization. We had architect B in the bottom right. I'll skip there. He mentioned that a place where he'd previously worked, it was like an assembly line, just integration after integration. And he said on the bottom left that mergers and acquisitions happen all the time and they rarely use the same architecture. And so you end up with these silos. Architect J mentioned that their organization had 5 customer-facing identity platforms. And this is a consumer, a market, a shop. And so the customer would come in and they talk to the photo app place and change the phone number for having, they change their address for having photos delivered. And then they go to the front, and then they'd be getting email or getting paper mail to their old address because the loyalty system was not related to the photo system. And so they had to change their address separately at each counter in the store. So we definitely see this sprawl in the industry. As we have done these interviews, we've had a few other notable problems that have come up, themes that seem to recur. Security comes up. People want more granular roles than are handed to them by specific out-of-the-box IDP or specific applications. They want to move towards zero trust solutions and authenticate more regularly in the flows, but that's hard to do with existing technology. This problem of matching the database record to the right consumer or right employee is a real challenge. Some people said it requires a new architecture to be able to do reliably, to be able to deduplicate records. Another said it's always a manual process to recognize when somebody's in the system more than once because there's no pattern to automate. And so a new architecture is needed to address that. We also have people say specifically they wanted an architecture that allowed them to move to be more of a web of data coming from various data sources and going to all the different data consumers in their organization. Another architect said they wanted to be able to simplify the systems at the same time as improving the user experience because it's often a trade-off. We heard governance come up a lot. That people want to reduce the data that they're holding because it's a liability. There's so many regulations to comply with. We heard that a couple of times. And also the internal challenge of when the firewall changes, how do you know everything needs to change? When you need a new integration, how do you get the port open? When the certificates expire, how do you get the new certificates pushed everywhere? That kind of governance. And as you move across cross-functional teams, being able to manage permissions gets even harder and offboarding those experiences. Fundamentally, people complain about a lack of flexibility. That for them to change the schema on the identity provider, they'd have to update all the integrations. Or some people said they wanted to adopt passkeys, but they were nervous that there were too many systems that couldn't handle passkeys, and how would they make that work? Being able to adapt to new use cases. Whenever the business comes and says, do this new thing, being able to do that quickly and be responsive, be the hero. And even when you have a system you think is working and everything's going well, some vendor somewhere is going to end a life a tool. And at that point, you've got to remove it and put in something new without breaking anything on a deadline. And that can be a real challenge. So those are just some of the examples of challenges we've heard raised by existing federation type IAM systems. Fundamentally, we need a different approach. So instead of focusing on connecting systems, we're going to think instead about an identity ecosystem. What is all the sources of data in your organization and where does it need to be reused? And so by packaging data, instead of thinking it as rows in a database, when you think about it as a reusable credential, it becomes natural to see these credentials move between the sources of data and the consumers of data in your organization. And so in this example, John's credential might say a specific address or a specific credit score or specific income. Now, this is confirmed by your trusted data source, but you're thinking of it as a package of data that's moving based on John's use case. And then you can put these credentials into John's wallet. It doesn't necessarily mean that John has to manage a mobile identity wallet, but by having the credential in John's tied specifically to John, then every time John does business, you can come and access that credential and all of John's data as needed for that use case. And this can be mobile app based, it can be cloud based, but it's stored, and it can be stored in their possession or on your infrastructure. We provide a lot of flexible tools for how you manage this wallet. But you're thinking of all these credentials into that wallet. So it's a change in mindset as you think about the data type. And then think about John, the user in this example, taking it where the data is needed. And that can be, in the right, John taking that reusable data between different IDPs. They could say, oh, Okta, here's my data. Oh, Ping Identity, here's my data. Oh, I got my data out of my Epic healthcare database, and now I'm taking it to the IDP where it needs to be used. Now, in many of these data situations, we need the user's consent. In my employment, I might be putting in a one-time pad, a one-time password or something, receiving a text message. Is a consumer, I'm consenting to data transfers. So whenever the human is moving around sharing data, or a representative of an organization is moving around sharing data, that becomes the transfer point for these credentials. And that way the data gets everywhere that person is interacting in the workflow. So this new data flow, when we need to onboard the user, we're going to do an identity proofing. We're going to say, John in this example is in front of me. This is the information that applies to John. That might come by requiring an ID via document verification process, where they take a picture of their passport. It might also just be that, based on John's password, here's the database entries that apply to John. You could do it that way. John's logged into the bank account, therefore I know this is the information about John that I can put in John's wallet. Then we're going to store that in a wallet that's user specific. Now it can be inconspicuous. John might see their patient ID and not realize that's 5 different credentials that's in a wallet. It's just, that's my ID in my mobile app. Or, I'm logged into my bank account online. That bank account happens to be tied to a wallet under the hood. Now, we're not saying that these concepts need to go to your user. But whenever John is interacting with the system, the bank account goes to the loan office, the bank account goes to the insurance broker, or in the patient example, you can think of all sorts of different providers that need access to patient information. Everywhere that this employee or this consumer or this patient goes, the data is available because they have access to their system, and therefore they have access to their wallet. And when they say, yes, I want to do business with you and I want to share this data, at that point the data gets transferred from the wallet to the relying party system. So the result is a very generic architecture that says during onboarding, we're going to issue information into a custom wallet that the holder has. And the user is going to interact with that custom wallet. And at various places where the user needs to either authenticate or authorize access, they can present the credentials that proves who they are and proves what systems they should have access to. And so applications will integrate with the verification APIs in order to do that authentication authorization. So this is generic. You can use any kind of credential, World Wide Web Consortium compliant verifiable credential to do this. You can use standard protocols like the OpenID protocols for verifiable credentials. Our employer, Truvera, Doc Labs has a product called Truvera, which provides APIs that tries to make this really simple. So you can call a REST API in order to issue. You can call a REST API in order to verify. And we provide, Agne's the product owner, for our wallet SDKs to embed into your existing apps, as well as provide backend storage in a SaaS cloud wallet in order to make it really seamless for the user. So that's how the architecture would work. Now, let's really dive into how that wallet integration would work, because I think that's key to understanding the whole system. So we're going to look at 4 example wallet flows. Now, there's a lot of flexibility here. You can mix and match, and there's variations on each one of these, but I think there's 4 key flows that our team's identified that people regularly want to do, that we want to make sure you can support from our wallet SDK. The first is that onboarding. So the client, they've got their little app, and whether they're a worker, an employee, or whether they're an external customer, and they go to the onboarding service, and that's going to do identity proofing. So they're going to request, please onboard me. And the identity proofing is going to say, okay, I need to redirect you to the wallet. And so that client app says, okay, here's the wallet, whether that's embedded in the client app or whether it's a cloud service. But at that point, the client is going to set up their access. Now, there's lots of ways to do this depending on how much control you want that client to have. It can be tied to the mobile device and it's stored on the mobile device. It might be in a cloud wallet and accessible via the biometrics, so now they can do this from any device. It might be a passkey, and so you'd have to sync that passkey around to get access to that wallet. Or it can be a mnemonic or a password. There's various ways to do this. But that access is going to be how the user re-authenticates with the wallet when they provide consent. And then after they have that wallet set up, it's going to return the wallet address to the client. The client then can give the wallet address to the issuer, the identity proofing service, and then it can issue into that wallet. So that's how that onboarding flow works. And again, there's lots of ways we can manage that user experience to make it straightforward in order to make it simple for the customer. If they're already dealing with one-time pads, instead of having to bring up your auth app, that's your wallet. If they're already having to provide a second factor, then there's a good reason to access that wallet. If they already using a biometric, then you can have the wallet be logged in with that biometric.
Yeah, in the end,
go ahead,
sorry. Yeah, in the end, I think the user in some use cases don't even need to know that the wallet exists. Like you said, like they already have a user experience that they're used to, so that does not have to impact it in any way. I am the product owner of the wallet, but sometimes the best wallet is the one that you never knew that existed or you don't know that exists. So
exactly true. Exactly right. So then we want to use this identity. We want to use these credentials we've just onboarded with. So whether it's for authorization or authentication, whether it's for authentication, authn, or authorization, auth-z, one common flow is the user is going to initiate from their app. And so I've got my banking app, I've got my web app, and I'm doing my business, and I say, okay, relying party, I want to access the call center now. Relying party, I want to access, the bank, the loan system. And so it sends that request with the wallet address. And then the relying party can call the REST API with the wallet address and say, I need to verify. And the wallet, during onboarding, we attach that wallet to the client app or to the client's mnemonic, right? Or the client's biometric. But now the wallet knows how to call out to the client and say, do you approve this? Can you give your consent for this data flow? And then the consumer, the employee can say, yes, I provide that consent. And then that response goes back to the relying party. So now they have all the information they need. So in this flow, this does tie in an app. Now, we don't always want an app. Sometimes the user is just going to go directly to the relying party service and say, I'm on the website, please let me in. And the relying party service is going to say, well, do you have access through your, we use Quotient as our example business all the time, through your Quotient wallet? And you say yes, or your Quotient ID, your Quotient Health ID. Do you have a Quotient Health ID? And you click the link that says, yes, I have a Quotient Health ID. That link is actually a redirect with the verification request to the wallet service. So when the user clicks the link on the relying party app, they end up on the wallet service little widget or page, however you want to do that user experience. And at that point, they say, yes, I want to share information out of my Quotient patient app with this relying party. And when they provide that consent, then that verification response can be delivered over a webhook to the relying party because they had that request, that individual request that did the redirect. Then our last example, sometimes the users calls into the call center, for example, like we mentioned, and that back office says, oh, I want to do a verification request. And they're going to click the button, verify Richard, verify Agne, verify John in this example. Now, we do need to know how to get to John's wallet. So John has to say, oh, my identifier that you use, my health identifier is ABC, my phone number, my email address. We're not going to use these things for authentication, but we're just using them to identify the wallet. And so then this call center can say, okay, click request for phone number blank, phone number 123. And the relying party then does that request. Because they have the phone number, they can look up. During onboarding, I associated this phone number with this wallet address. So now I can do the request directly to the wallet. The wallet knows how to go to the client and get consent. And then that consent comes back with the response and then gets delivered to the relying party. So that's the other flow we see quite often. And specifically, we end up developing this for call centers. And that's it works quite well for that, but there's a lot of other scenarios where it can be useful too. So now that we understand how the wallet's going to work, let's evolve. Let's look at that original example and figure out how we're going to evolve it. So we have this architecture. It's kind of messy, but it's pretty realistic. And we want to think, how do we make this easier by using credentials, by moving towards an ecosystem of data? Well, when we pick the one use case where people are complaining the most, that photo application use case, we never really integrated that well in the first place. So here we do need to add to the photo app the ability to access the user wallet and provide consent. And we need to make it so when our users are onboarding, they get credentials out of the identity proofing system. So we make those changes. And at that point, when a user who onboards as a client, then they say, oh, I want to download the photo app and manage and pick up my photos at the store. Then when they go to the store to pick up photos, they could scan the QR code to be able to share a credential, to be able to pick up their photos and do that as a credential without having a tight integration with the IDP system. When the same person decides they're going to call into the call center to ask questions about the pickup or deal with a problem, then that call center, it can use the existing IDP for all the users who don't have credentials yet. But if they have credentials, we can verify those credentials in order to authenticate with the call center. So there's a nice, so that one use case as a whole can be managed with the credential approach. Then we look and say, we still have some existing relying party applications that we need to integrate. We have 2 in this example, plus half of the call center, but it could be hundreds, as we talked about before. And instead of integrating each one individually, we can make the IDP deal with the credentials and still deliver a traditional OAuth token to the applications that are in the authorization realm. So to make this happen, we have our client application experiences, and we're going to integrate into these applications the ability to talk to the wallet to get consent. And then we're going to have each of our customers get credentials during identity proofing instead of just the ones that do the photos. Then when the customer returns, their experience is exactly the same regardless of the use case, where the IDP asks them to consent to share credentials. And then the IDP can deliver a traditional OAuth or SAML token to the applications that are relying parties. And at this point, that call center can work completely on credentials because it was already integrated to be able to handle the photo use case. We don't need additional changes for it to be able to work for all the other use cases. So that's this next stage. And of course, there's lots of flexibility. There's different ways you could do this, but that's a common next step in deploying a credential solution into an existing environment. I did get a little flustered with the recording problems. Did that make any sense, Agne? Any clarifications?
No, it does make sense. I really like this. I really like this slide as well. I don't know if anyone in the comments have additional questions, but so far, no one is screaming that you're talking nonsense. So I think we're good.
Good, that's excellent. I have to say, I do see some familiar names in the chat. So a lot of this came from my conversations with you. So I do appreciate everybody's contributions to this. Then the next stage of this is to integrate those additional applications directly. So instead of having them consume an OAuth token, we go modify the application to call the REST API to verify credentials. And that's nice because it gives you a lot more flexibility with these. Now, you might never proceed to phase 3. You might decide that all new applications use credentials, but the old ones continue to use the IDP. That's fine in a lot of circumstances. But we can go ahead and say, no, we want this additional flexibility. We're going to integrate the pharmacy pickup. We're going to integrate the loyalty by calling the verification API and getting credentials directly. And that allows us to move to that 4th phase where that IDP is not getting used so much anymore. Nothing's using it to verify. It's only being used for identity proofing. So if we change the client apps to do the identity proofing, then they just call into the issuing service and get the credentials, and we can get rid of that whole chunk in our architecture. Now, the best part about phase 4 is once we have this architecture, adding an additional identity proofing service it just plugs in. It's just call a different issuer. Adding an additional relying party, it just plugs in. It just call the credentials to verify. And so this can then expand into that data web. It can get as big as we need without having to constantly readjust what that centralized IAM service is doing. If we bring on a new line of business, maybe we're doing financial counseling next to the photo booth, right? then I can add this financial counseling. But wait, that's going to have to require additional, maybe we need a credit score transfer to the system. Well, we'll bring on a new issuer who can do that, and they issue to the customers who want to access the financial service counseling or the tax counseling. That's a better example, the tax counseling. In North America, we sometimes you have the tax booth next to the photo pickup. I don't know, we do things weird that way. But so if you want to use that, then you can onboard with that additional issuer, and then you can access that information with those additional verifiers. So that's how we can modify this flow. Now let's move on to talk really briefly some tips that come out of this conversation. First is, if your current architecture is working, we don't need to break it. We can do this incrementally. We can stop at different points. We can only tackle things that need to change anyway. Oh, did one of our vendors end of life a tool we're using? Well, that's a good opportunity to introduce change and start using a credential wallet. Do we want to introduce passkeys? Well, if we got to sync passkeys between systems, then maybe we should just be using credentials and have a credential wallet. Oh, we need to make sure we have a more reliable second factor, or we need to introduce a biometric. Well, those are places where you're changing anyway, and so it'd be good to think about adding that credential wallet. Then we're going to look and we're going to say, what are all the systems that need to use data, and what is the level of assurance they need? What are the policies we need to create that data? And then we can inventory our data sources. Okay, does the data meet our level of assurance? Do we need to bring on new sources of data, new identity providers, or new identity services, databases that allow us to get the information we need? And then how do we attach that data to a specific human? How do we know that the person in front of the HR desk is the employee and gets the right access? Or how do we make sure the person calling in the call center is the right person? Maybe it's that they have a username and password to access the bank account already. Maybe it's that they already have the mobile app installed that says they're a customer of the phone company. Now, there are a lot of different ways we can do this, but we do need to attach it to a specific individual to be able to put it in their wallet. At this point, we want to architect for flexibility. So let's have the user carry their credentials around the internal identity ecosystem. And then we can think about that user experience. What wallet is needed? Are they already doing an OAuth flow? Can we avoid changing the user experience? Can we simplify the user experience as we introduce a wallet? Then we're going to deploy one use case at a time, seeking to receive value at each phase, like Agne mentioned, whoever's complaining the most. Frequently, when we work with a new customer, they get so excited about credentials, the possibilities of being able to reuse. Once the user has identity in their identity wallet, they could take it to an external partner and be able to complete that flow without me sending a spreadsheet over. We can have our employees be able to share, move to a different business unit or a partner company and share their employment information. We can get credentials from our supply chain people to make sure only the right suppliers have access to our facilities. That's all great. And yes, you can get there, but that's going to require lawyers. Once you start working with external partners, then you've got to rework business agreements and legal agreements and liability and insurance. So I recommend starting on the internal use case, making sure you can get that to work before you start trying to move to like an open ecosystem identity interaction. Agne, are there any tips that you'd add to this list?
No, I'm giggling a little bit. I think one of the things here, why it's best to start with internal than external, what we've seen with some of the partners, and everyone gets excited. It's a interesting technology, the opportunities are endless, but the biggest problem is usually not the technical implementation, but the business rules and the agreements around it. So as soon as you involve external partners, the bigger the organization, you can add, mums to every legal contract, so it just expands, and it's not a technical problem. Then in the end, it's a business operations kind of problem. So I definitely agree that internal use cases are the ones where you get the quickest fruits.
Excellent insight. So let's talk about some trade-offs. We're not selling a magic wand here. We recognize that every architectural decision has trade-offs. We want to make sure that as you incorporate this tool into your set of tools that you have as an identity architect, that you recognize some of the challenges that are involved here. Introducing a user wallet is always a big change. Trying to get that into an existing architecture. It's a change that has benefits, and like we've talked about, you could hide that wallet in a lot of ways, but it is a significant change. So you should make sure you understand what you're getting for the change you're making. Also recognize that verifiable credentials, the W3C standard, these are new technologies. There's limited integrations with existing systems. The standard was only approved by the World Wide Web Consortium a couple of years ago, and most IAM systems don't have direct support for verifiable credentials. A few do, and we have partners who have integrated verifiable credentials into IDV systems, for example. But most relying parties, they'll probably have point and click for SAML. They'll probably have point and click for OAuth. They probably don't have point and click for verifiable credentials. You'll need to build a custom integration with the REST API. It's a pretty easy REST API, but it is an additional step. And then also recognize, once you get rid of that that IDP, the identity provider piece, that centralized piece of your architecture, you get a lot of benefits to flexibility, but you lose that centralized reporting. And that can be a big change for a lot of shops. If that's where you rely on instrumenting for security, if that's where you rely on instrumenting in order to ensure that you can pass audits, then you're going to have to look at doing that in a decentralized way. Now, our customers have found that there are excellent ways. You have to end up with a more robust, decentralized logging solution, or having each verifier report on what they're doing gives you a better view about how things are getting used in your ecosystem, your internal identity ecosystem, but it is a change. Now, with these challenges, though, you do get some big advantages. You have that flexibility you can always add a new credential, you can always add a new application without impacting anything else. And that is huge flexibility. That's like the promised land, right? And like we mentioned, this internal architecture, it can extend across organizational boundaries, partner organizations, business units, different jurisdictions, different country regimes. So that's really powerful. And it incorporates data management and privacy protections as part of the architecture. So if that's something you've been worried about integrating, you get that pretty much for free. We have a completely separate presentation about this next point, but you can tie credentials to the human's biometric to be able to check that biometric all the way through the process in a very clean way that's still privacy preserving. So if you're interested in that, you can look at our YouTube history. We have another webinar we did about that last year. That can be very powerful. And then that zero trust. Instead of saying, oh, once you've authenticated with the IDV, you're authorized for all sorts of applications. Well, no, we're checking credentials every time you're needing access. And those credentials are signed and encrypted by design, and they're coming from a wallet that you don't have to trust the wallet in order to trust the data out of the wallet. So it changes your trust boundaries in order to help you have that zero trust architecture that's being recommended by NIST and other standards bodies. We'll probably talk more about zero trust in another masterclass in the future. So that's the recommendation I'd make for how to evolve your architecture. I recognize this is a masterclass. You're all IAM architects, or many of you are IAM architects. So I'm really interested in the questions you have and the recommendations you have. And of course, we always love to discuss this about your specific environment as well.
Definitely. So thank you so much, Richard, and thank you everyone for the patience. I don't see a lot of questions yet, but we do have a few, so maybe let's go through it. We also don't have a lot of time left either. So first, I see that the last one was Pierce's question in the chat. Richard, do you think it's fair to say that this presentation demonstrates both the business wallet and the consumer wallet interaction?
Well, it definitely, the solution works for both business wallets and consumer wallets. I haven't really thought whether it does a good job at demonstrating both. I hope it did. I do want to clarify, I talked a lot about workforce wallets versus consumer wallets, and we did talk specifically about that. But there are also organizational wallets, and I didn't really spend time on that in this presentation. We probably want another class on that at some point. But an organization can hold credentials, and then they can delegate authority with those credentials to their employees. And we didn't really cover that in this presentation, Pierce. I don't know if you're referring to that, but that's something that I would like to go into more. We definitely have models to solve that today. And it's a whole set of additional capabilities that you get with this kind of architecture.
Yes, and I think as you mention delegation. That's definitely a topic for another webinar. But when we talk about, or when we talk with IM people and architecture, everyone is very reluctant to change. Architecture is such a fundamental thing. It needs a very big disruption to actually motivate people. And you're probably not allowed on the internet anymore if you don't mention AI. So with AI and AI agents coming and introducing, all of these things will need to change anyway. And we do think that this type of architecture is flexible enough to allow these kind of changes in the workforce as well. So I'll leave it as a cliffhanger for next webinar. I do have another question. This was actually for me while Richard, you were coming back, but it was also a question about the wallet. So what do we expect the split to be between the web wallet and the mobile wallet? And I'll answer how I think, and Richard, I'm curious what you think as well. So it's interesting because originally when I joined Doc, for me, it was only mobile wallet with my identity. I come from Lithuania and we do something that's very similar to Bank ID. So having your identity in your mobile and using it wherever you go, it was such a normal thing to do. I didn't even think that there is another need or another way. But now working through other use cases, you do see that I'm not sure, like in order to achieve the best user experience, I do see that the web wallet has more, maybe it's more universal. It's less dependent on the user. It's easier to manage. Like we have to deal with so much things. We really want to start managing wallets, and there's a lot of problems there. So I'm kind of 50-50 now, probably leaning more towards that the web wallets will have more usage, even though like both of these approaches have their own specific use case and their niches. But curious, Richard, what do you think?
Yeah, if we talked about how if you don't have an app, then you need to authenticate directly to the wallet. And that does require a certain dependency. So if I'm doing internal use cases, I'm only working with one company, then having that company say, oh, do you have your patient ID installed? And having that link that goes directly to the web app with the patient ID works very well. But if I'm trying to work across different organizations and they might be using different wallets, then having a link to each web wallet, there's no standard today for finding a website that has your wallet in it. And that's where coming back to that mobile device becomes much more helpful. So there's a new standard called the Digital Credentials API that says this website, this app is asking for a credential. Android or Apple don't have it in the keychain. Let's find a wallet provider on my device in order to fulfill that credential. So that flexibility, you have to have a mobile device to do that as opposed to a web experience. So I guess I agree with you, Agne, that the web wallet is very easy to embed in existing flows, and I think 50-50 is probably about right. If I'm building a solution specific to my current customers within my walled garden, I want a decentralized architecture, but I'm not worried about having a whole bunch of independent identity providers or verifiers, then that web wallet works really well. But if I want to expand beyond that, then I probably do need to introduce a mobile app. Now, the nice thing is they can coexist in the same ecosystem. The mobile app can store on the web, in the cloud wallet, and they can use the same credentials in both flows.
Yes, definitely. I forgot about that, but one of the beauty of the wallets that you don't have to pick and choose. You can have a combined experience and that's the whole point of this webinar, right? The data travels with the user. So where user goes, the data can come, and the wallet is just where the credentials are carried. So exactly. I don't think, Richard, we have any more questions. If you can skip to the next slide. So just we have the contacts.
So Jim asked about agentic IAM frame, or he commented that agentic IAM frameworks are leveraging wallets and VCs as well. Agne, do you want to share? At some point, we're going to do a full hour on agentic ID, but do you want to give the 2-minute teaser of everything you've been living and breathing for the last 6 months?
Oh God, 2 minutes. That's it's gonna be hard, but in general, yes. And a lot of agentic use cases, especially the ones that we're working on, they're based on the delegation, and so the agents need identity, the humans, they have identity, but they need to delegate some kind of authority to their agents, and verifiable credentials are such a natural technological fit for that. So it's a longer conversation. We do see that this is something that a lot of companies should be working on or should be introducing. Like, everyone is excited to talk about AI. I use AI a lot, and I'm very excited to let AI do a lot of my work for me. But when you look at it responsibly, especially introducing it in the workforce, we have these conversations quite often in our organization as well. Oh, let's ask Claude to do this and that, and then someone, usually the more technical, security-oriented people, say, "Oh, well, let's first check, like, if we can stop it doing what you don't want to do." So, and that's where it all comes in. So this is not a pitch yet, but Jim, I definitely agree that agents and can use wallets, and they probably should, and the verifiable credentials are a good way to introduce this and to make it more secure. So yeah, we'll talk more about this.
Excellent. Looks like Paul snuck in one more question, which is great. Thank you, Paul. When will Apple and Google support VCs in their wallets? That's an interesting question that does require a bit of a crystal ball. So understand that we're all guessing. But what we found is that, well, first we should say what exactly is a verifiable credential. So the World Wide Web Consortium has a standard for verifiable credentials, the verifiable credential data model. And Google and Apple have not been very excited about supporting that. They seem to want, they do support credentials in their wallets, custom credentials, but it's a very defined format, and you have to get approval for what schemas you want to put in. They do now support the ISO standard for mobile driver's licenses and mobile documents, MDL-MDoc from the 18013 standard. And those could be considered a type of verifiable credential. But they only support them with those defined schemas from a jurisdiction, a country who's approved to issue those kind of credentials. So we do find that having a platform like Truvera that allows you flexibility to define your own credential types and have that live alongside the Apple or Google wallets is the way people can solve this today. Whether Google and Apple eventually allow more flexibility in their systems, I don't know. Google seems to be. I did have a conversation at the Internet Identity Workshop with a Google engineer who said that their plan is to support the Digital Credentials API to be able to pull custom credentials out of third-party wallets. So that's in beta now, but it's publicly available on Android, and Apple's moving in that direction. So you'll be able, so instead of them supporting holding any arbitrary verifiable credential, they'll support the Digital Credentials API, and you'll pull that out of the Truvera app that's on the same phone, or whatever wallet you decide to. You can use the Truvera SDK to embed that wallet into any app you wanted. Apple, a typical Apple fashion, they have not been as clear about what their plans are. So we see that they do now support the Digital Credentials API. We also see in their documentation that they're supporting the ISO standard for MDLs, but they haven't indicated one way or another what their plans are for W3C compliant verifiable credentials. My suspicion is they're going to keep it pretty locked down and inflexible for some time, which is why we've spent so much time trying to build this flexible SDK that can live alongside those using the Digital Credentials API. That answer got a little bit meandering, but hopefully that gave you the information you're looking for with my best guess.
Great. So, Richard, I think we're at the time now, and so I just want to thank everyone for watching, and we wanted to include this as well. So for people who are at the stage when VCs are on the roadmap and they not sure how to introduce it, or they have done a POC already and they don't know what comes next. So we're offering free consultations, and in those we'll walk through the specific architecture and look at the current systems and help identify which use cases to start with. So you can book that by reaching out to us. The contacts are on the slide, sales@doc.io. Also, I have to mention that we'll send the recording to this and the slides to everyone who registers, so you can go back and see those architectures and all of the best practices here. And yeah, so thanks everyone for joining, and I hope we'll see you in the future webinars.